I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. Now, a stark warning came from the top intelligence officials in Germany. They said specifically that Russia could be able to rebuild its military capabilities and potentially challenge NATO by the end of this decade. Now, this is a warning to be taken seriously. However, there is also a question of what sort of aggression could that be and what are the ways to avert this danger. And about all this, we're going to be talking with our guest today, Taras Kuzio, Professor of Political Science at National University of the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
So first question, why do you think this warning comes now? Do you think there are any factors which prompted German officials to issue this particular message at this very time?
Well, similar kinds of warnings have been taking place for at least about a year. Remember, President Macron also was worried to such an extent that he actually even talked about maybe the need to send French and other European troops if the Russian military offensive was threatening Kiev. So it's not completely new that this has been said, but I think that it's also to do now, a new factor is maybe the fear that there is kind of declining interest in Europe and the United States in maybe providing military aid to Ukraine, maybe the fear of Donald Trump being elected and ending military aid to Ukraine, and kind of growing informal pressure on Ukraine to undertake negotiations with Russia, which would lead to some kind of territorial, still remaining under Russian occupation. So I think it's a mixture of these factors. But one has to ask, so what? He's made this assertion, but nothing really will fundamentally change. The German government, led by Chancellor Scholz, still remains the strongest opponent in the West against Ukraine joining NATO, and Germany, including Scholz, has refused to even send Taurus missiles to Ukraine. The Americans at least have sent Attacker missiles, but they only allow them to be used inside Ukraine. Scholz has not even sent and has refused to send Taurus missiles. So the German head of intelligence could be saying this, but at the same time, I don't see Germany changing its policy anytime soon.
So do you think Olaf Scholz can afford to ignore such stark warnings? Because it is not just about Ukraine, although obviously this is a very important issue, but also about the fundamental program of rebuilding Germany's military capabilities. So no doubt this particular statement is intended to galvanize the government into action. So do you think this is going to work, or do you think Olaf Scholz is still going to block these attempts or make half-hearted attempts at implementing the program?
I think it's going to be half-hearted attempts. A few days after the Russian invasion in February 2022, Chancellor Scholz talked about Germany doing a fundamental transformation in response to this, including cancelling Nord Stream 2. Most analysts believe that fundamental transformation of German security policy, military policy, has not actually happened. It's more talk than actual words. I mean, it's taking a long time for Germany to reach 2% spending on defense of its GDP, even though Germany is probably the wealthiest country in Europe. Nevertheless, Germany is very slow in both reforming its military and increasing its military expenditure. So I don't expect this to change anytime soon. And this comment from the head of German intelligence should be placed in the context of comments a few months ago where Germany talked about reducing military aid to Ukraine next year. So on the one hand, we have Germany talking about the potential threat to NATO and to Germany if Ukraine is defeated. On the other hand, they are sending less military aid to Ukraine. So there's a contradiction inside Germany itself.
To say that this is a contradiction, in fact, is an understatement. Why do you think world leaders are not realizing the very simple mechanism? If Ukraine wins the war, the threat will be averted, perhaps even for decades. With a Russia that's defeated and that's unable to rebuild its military, there will be no need for major military spending. I mean, the spending will still have to be there to make sure, but no major risk of confrontation. And yet, many leaders say, oh, let's just make a quick peace deal, let's force Ukraine into territorial concessions, and let's assume that Putin is not going to attack again.
Well, I think it's a product of a number of things. One major important product is that there are no strong Western leaders. I mean, there are no kind of, I grew up as a teenager in the 1980s when you had Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States. There's nobody of that equivalence today. There's no strong kind of Western leader. Biden does not fulfill that role. Scholz is extremely weak. He's quite left wing on and fearing escalation. He comes from that left wing of German politics, which was always ready to kind of get the war over and let's restart business. So I think it's a mixture of lack of political will, lack of strong Western leaders, and an unwillingness among key countries like the United States and Germany in particular to actually openly say our goal is Russia's military defeat.
We should probably also mention, if I may, we should probably also mention leaders who want to be seen as strong, but they happen to follow this sort of right-wing concept of ending the war really quickly, and again, not really caring for the implications, of course, referring to, in particular, Donald Trump.
I mean, we had 3 decades of Western democracies basically reducing their military spending, kind of talking about a democracy gain, the end of history, sort of that famous phrase. And suddenly we're now awaking to the fact that the Cold War never ended, in fact, and there's still, I think, a strong refusal to accept that de facto Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, this axis, are at war with us. I don't think Western leaders want to tell their publics that this is reality. I mean, there are North Korean troops in Ukraine. North Korean. China is the main enabler of Russia's military machine. Without China's exports to Russia, Russia's military would not be able to function. Iran sends, drones and missiles, and Russia sends military equipment. Russia could be enabling Iran's nuclear arsenal. So all of this is taking place, and the West is still asleep. It makes you wonder why there's a kind of a short-term limit on kind of the way they want to see it. They want, as it were, to kind of wrap up the war quickly, force Ukraine to some kind of concessions, and then hopefully the problem will go away. As you rightly say, it will not go away, because the only way to make it go away is to defeat Putin. As long as Putin is Russian president, there will be a threat to Europe. And if Ukraine is defeated, the Baltic states will be next, and then Poland will be next.
And to what extent do you think this risk actually may occur within this time frame? Some time ago, an expert on Russia, Mark Galeotti, said that Russia has wasted its military potential. It has been building it up for like 2 decades, and it was wasted this potential within a year. He suggested that it might take Russia a decade to rebuild, assuming that sanctions will not, keep biting into the capabilities of the Russian industry. So do you think that this may actually happen later than the German intelligence thinks? And also, do you believe that some sort of deal with China, a deal between Washington and Beijing, could actually be what really matters here, not what Moscow does?
Well, I mean, the myth that somehow, you can do like Richard Nixon did. He did a deal with China against the Soviet Union. That's not going to happen today, because most Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, see China as the bigger threat, not Russia, because China's a rising power, Russia's a declining power. So, and the idea of splitting, the American phrase, parking Russia and focusing on China, is a myth, because they are all involved in one axis. China cannot allow Russia's military defeat, because that would be a threat, seen as a kind of a threat to China's kind of idea of replacing the so-called US-led unipolar world with a multipolar world. I think that Mark Galeotti is wrong on the time frame. I think the German intelligence is far better on this. And there are three factors here. Firstly, Western sanctions have failed largely. Yes, Europe has divested itself of importing Russian energy, but Russia still manages with its own kind of secret fleet to export lots of oil and gas, particularly to India and China. And so Russia continues to get money from energy exports. Secondly, components from Western countries still manage to get to Russia, and they're used to build Russian missiles. Most of the components in the missiles fired at Ukraine from Russia are American components. So those sanctions are not actually fully working. And thirdly, Russia has a resource that Mark Galeotti ignores, and that is a zombified population. A population that's willing to die in the kind of numbers that no Western democracy would ever be allowed to do. 1,200 casualties a day.
And that is a stark warning indeed. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but warnings like that are necessary in order to galvanize the public into action. And this conflict can still be won by helping Ukraine. That's something that politicians should really take into account. Taras Kuzio was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us.